The necklace was called the Vero Star, and for 300 years, it had never once left the family before a wedding. It was 7 sapphires strung on white gold, the center stone as broad as a thumbnail, cut in a way no living jeweler could copy. Every Duchess of Hailwick had worn it at her wedding since the reign of the second king of that name. It was not jewelry, it was a promise made in stone, that the woman who wore it belonged to the house, and the house belonged to her. Wren Ashcombe had held it in her hands exactly once, 4 days before the ceremony, in the long, cold room they called the Muniment Gallery. The steward had let her look but not touch, and she had kept her hands folded behind her back like a child at a shop window. She had not needed to hold it. In 11 days, she would wear it, walking the length of the chapel toward the man she was to marry, and then it would be hers to keep until she passed it to a daughter of her own. That was the plan. Plans, she was learning, were a kind of weather. You could dress for them and still be caught in the rain. The great hall of Hailwick was full that evening. 200 candles, the good silver down from the vaults, the long tables dressed in white for the betrothal feast. The last great gathering before the wedding itself. Wren stood near the head of the room, in a gown of pale dove-gray, her hands folded, her face composed in the way she had trained it to be composed. She had learned young that a still face gave nothing away, and that people who gave nothing away were rarely robbed of it. The Duke of Hailwick, Renwick Vale, 9th of that title, rose from his seat. He was tall and dark and unsmiling, a man who wore authority the way other men wore a coat, without seeming to notice the weight of it. He lifted his hand, and the hall fell quiet by degrees, the way a pond stills after a stone. "You have all come a long way," he said, "to honor a promise this house means to keep." A murmur of approval. Wren felt her heartbeat, slow and even. Soon he would call her forward. Soon he would fasten the Vero Star at her throat before all these witnesses, and the promise would be sealed in the old way, and there would be no unmaking it. She had waited a long time for this, longer and for stranger reasons than any soul in that hall could have guessed. A footman approached the high table, carrying a flat case of dark wood. Inside, on a bed of old velvet, lay the necklace. The candlelight caught the center sapphire and threw a small blue fire across the ceiling. The Duke lifted it. 300 years of white gold ran through his fingers like water. Wren took a half-step forward. He did not look at her. He turned instead to the young woman seated at his right hand, golden, laughing, lovely, a woman Wren had met only twice, and both times briefly, and he raised the Vero Star, and he fastened it around her throat. The clasp closed with a small sound that somehow carried the length of the silent hall. For one heartbeat, nobody breathed. The golden woman touched the stones at her collarbone and gave a small, delighted gasp. The Duke's hands rested a moment on her shoulders, and 200 faces turned, slowly, terribly, toward the girl in dove-gray, standing alone near the head of the room, with her hands still folded and nothing at all left to hold. Wren looked at the necklace on another woman's neck. She looked at the man who had placed it there. And then, and this was the thing they would all speak of for years afterward, in kitchens and carriages and letters sent to relations far away, she smiled. It was not a bitter smile. It was not the smile of a woman about to weep or scream or fall. It was small and calm and almost kind, the smile of someone who has just been told something they already suspected and finds a strange relief in the confirming of it. She inclined her head once to the Duke, as one might to a stranger who has done one a small courtesy. Then she turned and she walked the length of that silent hall between the staring tables, her steps unhurried, her spine straight, the candlelight sliding over her gray gown, and she passed through the great doors and out into the dark, and she did not look back. The doors closed behind her. And in the hall, the Duke of Hailwick stood with his hands still resting on another woman's shoulders and watched the place where she had been, and for the first time in his adult life, Renwick Vale felt the cold, precise certainty that he had just made a mistake he did not yet understand. Why had she smiled? He would have given a great deal in that moment to know. He would come to give a great deal more. The porter's name was Old Cobb, and he had kept the east gate of Halewick for 41 years, which meant he had seen a great many people leave in a great many states, and he knew the difference between them all. He knew the flouncing exit of the offended guest who wanted to be followed. He knew the stumbling exit of the drunk and the furious silent exit of the man who is lost at cards, and the weeping exit of the maid, dismissed without a character. He had a name in his head for each of them, sorted like keys on a ring. He had no name for the one who came to his gate that night. She came out of the dark on foot, in a gray gown too fine for walking and thin shoes never meant for the road, and she asked him, very quietly, very politely, whether the night carrier still passed the crossroads before dawn. Her voice did not shake. Her hands, when she drew her shawl around her, did not shake either. But there was a stillness on her that Cobb had felt only twice before in his long life, both times at deathbeds, and it raised the hair on his old arms. "There's a betrothal feast up at the house tonight, miss," he said carefully, because he did not yet know who she was. "You'll not be wanting to miss it." "I've seen the part of it that concerned me," she said. And she smiled at him, the same small, calm smile, and something in it made the old man's chest ache without his knowing why. He told her the carrier came at 4:30. He told her she might wait in the lodge by his little fire, which he did not offer to guests, as a rule, and which he could not afterward explain having offered to her. She thanked him and sat, and she did not fidget, and she did not cry. And after a while, Cobb went out to check the road on an errand that did not need checking, only because sitting in a room with that much quiet grief had begun to frighten him. When he came back, she was gone. She'd left a coin on the bench, not payment, he understood, but a kindness returned for a kindness, and she'd banked his fire so it wouldn't die before morning, which no guest of that house had ever thought to do in 41 years. Cobb kept that coin the rest of his life. He could not have said why. But this is the thing worth knowing, the thing the great hall did not see, and the great house would not learn for a long time yet. Old Cobb was not the only one who watched her go. High in the north face of Halewick, a narrow window above the stable court, an old woman stood with a candle in her hand and watched the small gray figure cross the moonlit yard toward the east gate. This woman had not been at the feast. This woman was never at feasts. She was called Marable. No one living remembered whether it was her given name or her family's, and she had been at Halewick longer than the Duke had been alive, longer than Old Cobb, longer than the furniture. She had nursed the present Duke's father and his father before that, and she kept now to 2 small rooms in the oldest part of the house, and was spoken of by the younger servants the way children speak of a thing they have not quite seen. Marable watched the girl cross the yard. She watched the small square of her shoulders and the unhurried certainty of her walk. And Marable, who had said perhaps 40 words in the past year and cared for the opinion of no living person, set down her candle and spoke aloud to the empty room. "There she goes," the old woman said, "and she's the only true thing that's walked through this house in 20 years. Fools." She pressed one knotted hand flat against the cold glass. "You've thrown out the one you needed and kept the ones you'll wish you hadn't. God help you when you learn it." Below, in the bright and crowded hall, no one heard her. No one ever did. The girl in gray reached the shadow of the east gate and passed through it, and was gone into the country dark. And the old woman at the window stayed there a long time after, watching the empty yard, as though she could still see something the rest of them could not. She could. But that comes later. Her name was not Wren Ashcombe. That is to say, she answered to it, and had signed it, and had been introduced by it to 200 people that very night. But it was a coat she had put on, not a skin she had been born in, and she had put it on for a reason that none of the fine folk in that hall would have believed if she had stood on the high table and shouted it. Her name was Rena Calloway, and she had not come to Halewick to be a duchess. She had come to prove a murder. 3 years before, in a narrow house in the cathedral city of Ferring, her father had died. Silas Calloway had been a maker of clocks and finer things, a man whose hands could set 100 wheels turning inside a case no bigger than an egg, and in the last years of his life he had done work for great houses across the county, repairing and restoring the old mechanisms the gentry could no longer mend themselves. He had been honest to the point of inconvenience, gentle to the point of foolishness, and he had raised his daughter alone after her mother died, teaching her the trade as though she were the son he'd never had. By 15 she could strip and rebuild a movement in the dark by feel. By 18 she was better than he was, and he said so often and proudly. Then he took a commission at a great house 2 days' ride from Ferring. He was gone a month. He came home, changed, quiet, watchful, sleeping poorly, starting at sounds. He would not say what troubled him. He told Rena only that he had seen something he ought not to have seen, and that he was making arrangements, and that if anything should happen to him she was to trust no one who came smiling, and to look inside the tall case clock in his workshop, the one he had built for himself and never sold. 11 days later they found him at the foot of the cathedral steps, dead, and the constable wrote misadventure in his book, and the matter was closed before Rena had finished washing his body for burial. She did not believe it. She had known her father step on those stairs for 18 years. He did not fall, but a clockmaker's daughter has no standing to contradict a constable, and grief is not evidence, and so she buried him and said nothing and waited, because waiting was a thing she had been trained to do. A movement runs at the speed it runs, and you cannot hurry it without breaking it. She looked inside the tall case clock, as he had told her. Behind the pendulum, in a slot her father's clever hands had cut into the very back of the case, she found a single object, wrapped in oiled cloth, a small brass wheel, no wider than a coin, its teeth cut in a pattern she had never seen in any movement, irregular, deliberate, wrong for any clock, and with it a scrap of paper in her father's hand. 4 words only. It counts the dead. She did not understand it. She spent a year not understanding it, a year of piecing together where her father had gone, whose house he had worked in, what he might have seen. The great house, she learned at last, belonged to the Duke of Hailwick. And the more quietly she asked after Hailwick, the more she found that the county spoke of it in a particular way, with respect and with a lowering of the voice, and with a habit of not quite finishing their sentences. Rich men who had disputes with the house had a way of dying tidily. A steward who had threatened to talk was lost one dry summer in circumstances no one could quite explain. And beneath the Duke's own name always ran a second name, spoken lower, still, his cousin and man of business, the one who truly ran the estate's affairs, a smooth and smiling gentleman called Tulliver Sedge. It was Sedge who had hired her father. It was Sedge who had paid for the funeral, unasked, and sent a kind letter of condolence to a daughter he had never met. Trust no one who comes smiling. So Rena Calloway had made herself into Wren Ashcombe. It had taken the better part of a year, and nearly all the money she had, a dead gentlewoman's papers bought from a dishonest clerk, a false aunt, played by an old actress of her father's acquaintance, who had written the letters of introduction that opened the first doors, a borrowed history, a borrowed manner, a borrowed name from a family remote enough that no one would check. She had aimed herself at Hailwick like a key cut for one lock, and when the young Duke, recently come into his title, in want of a suitable and undemanding wife, and privately guided in the matter by his cousin Sedge, had let it be known he sought a bride of good family and no great fortune, she had made herself into exactly the woman he was looking for. She had never meant to marry him. She had meant to be inside the walls, inside the household, inside the one place her father had gone before he changed, with a bride's freedom to walk any corridor and open any door and search at last for whatever it was that counted the dead. The engagement was the disguise. The wedding was to have been the beginning of the true work. And then, tonight, the Duke had placed the Vero star around another woman's neck and shut the door of the house against her and thrown her out into the dark, never knowing that he had not defeated an enemy, but merely delayed one, and that the woman he had humiliated before 200 witnesses was the single most dangerous person who had crossed his threshold. In 100 years, that was why she had smiled. She had smiled because a locked door only stops the honest. She had smiled because she now knew past all doubt that there was something in that house worth the cruelty of keeping her out of it. And she had smiled because, walking the length of that silent hall with every eye upon her, Rena Calloway had understood a thing her enemies had not. They thought they had ended it. They had only just made her free to begin. The town of Ferring took her back the way a river takes back a stone, with barely a ripple, and no memory of it after. Rena returned to the narrow house near the cathedral 3 days after the feast, having sold the last of the fine gray gown to a dealer in the market town between, and bought in its place the plain brown wool of a working woman. She let herself into her father's workshop, which she had kept and could not bear to keep, and she sat among the silent clocks in the dark, until the cold drove her to light a fire. Then she took the little brass wheel from the seam of her petticoat where it had lived for a year, and she set it on the workbench in the lamplight, and she looked at it as she had looked at it 100 times. It counts the dead. She knew clockwork the way other women knew scripture, and she knew, turning the small wheel between her fingers, that it belonged to no clock ever made to tell the time. The teeth were cut in a rhythm that would make any ordinary movement stutter and jam. It was made to count to advance one place, and stop and hold, and advance again only when something outside it moved. A tally wheel. A wheel that turned once for each of some particular thing and remembered the number, even when no one was watching. Her father had built and mended 100 such counting mechanisms in his life, for mills that tallied sacks, for toll gates that tallied carts, for a brewery that tallied barrels. This one was finer than any of them, cut by a master meant to sit inside something large and old and important, something that already stood in a house and would not be questioned, something a clockmaker might be called in to repair without anyone thinking twice, and her father had written those 4 words and then died on the cathedral steps. It counts the dead. She did not sleep that night, or the next. She wrote out everything she knew and everything she guessed in the small, precise hand her father had taught her, and she saw at last that guessing had carried her as far as guessing could. The answer was inside Halewick. It had always been inside Halewick, and the front door was now closed to her forever. So she would go in another way. It was here that she made the choice that would test her more sorely than anything her enemies devised, and she made it with her eyes open. She had a skill. Great houses were forever in want of that skill, and forever careless about who they let in to practice it, because a person on their knees over a broken mechanism is invisible in the way that servants are invisible. Beneath notice, beneath suspicion, a pair of hands and nothing more. She would not go back as a lady. Ladies were watched. She would go back as what her father had been. A mender of clocks come at the housekeeper's summons, admitted at the kitchen door, free to move from room to room wherever the great mechanisms of the house had need of her. To do it, she would have to unmake, thread by thread, the disguise that had cost her a year and everything she owned. Wren Ashcombe, who had nearly been a duchess, would have to become no one at all. She would have to walk back into the house that had shamed her before 200 people, and bow her head, and be spoken to as a servant is spoken to by the very people who had watched her walk out. She thought it would be the shame that tested her. She was wrong about that, as she would learn. But she braced for the shame, and she cut her hair shorter than a lady wears it, and she roughened her soft hands deliberately against the workbench until they looked like a tradeswoman's hands again, and she practiced the flat, plain speech of faring until the borrowed gentility fell away. There remained the matter of getting summoned here. Fortune, which had used her cruelly, paid back a little of its debt. She learned, for Ferring's clockmakers all knew one another, and gossiped as tradesmen do, that the great turret clock at Halewick had been ailing for 2 years. It ran fast, then slow, then stopped altogether for a day, and started again of its own accord, and no man the estate had called in could find the fault. 2 had been dismissed for failing. The work was known in the trade as cursed, and no one in the county would take it now. Rena wrote to the housekeeper of Halewick, a Mrs. Ostler, whose name she had learned in her months as a bride-to-be, in the character of one Rena Poole, a clockmaker's widow lately of Faring, carrying on her late husband's trade, willing to attempt the work others had abandoned, and willing to do it for less. She sealed the letter. She held it a long moment over the candle, not to burn it, only to feel the weight of what she was doing. Then she sent it, and she waited, and a fortnight later a reply came in a crabbed, unfriendly hand. Come Thursday. The gate at the kitchen court. Ask for no one. She read it twice. She folded it into her breast. And Rena Calloway, who had left Halewick in dove-gray silk to the stairs of 200, prepared to return to it in brown wool, unremarked, through the kitchen door, carrying in her sewn hem, the one small brass wheel that had cost her father his life and meant to find the great dead thing it belonged to. Come Thursday she would come. The Duke of Halewick had not slept well since the night of the feast, and he did not know why, and not knowing why was, for a man like Renwick Vale, a species of torture. He was a man built for certainty. He had been raised to it. The only son, the heir, taught before he could read that a duke's chief duty was to know his lands, his tenants, his rights, his mind. Doubt was a thing that happened to lesser men. He had ordered his whole life to keep it at bay, and for the most part he had succeeded, and the price of that success was that when doubt did come for him at last, he had no practice at bearing it, and it went through his defenses like water through sand. It had come for him over a girl, in a gray gown, who had smiled. He stood now at the tall window of his study, in the grim hour before a winter dawn, and he made himself examine the thing again, as he had examined it a dozen times. He had done what his cousin advised. Tolliver Sedge had come to him a week before the feast, grave and reluctant, bearing letters that showed the girl Wren Ashcombe was not what she claimed, that her family was a fiction, that her aunt was a hired actress, that the whole engagement was a fraud practiced upon the house by an adventuress after his name and his fortune. And there had been a solution ready to hand, for Sedge had also produced a true gentlewoman, the golden, laughing Lady Coruscant, daughter of an old and unimpeachable family, delighted to be presented as the honest alternative before the assembled county. Shame the false one publicly. Sedge had counseled, let 200 witnesses see the necklace given to the true bride. No scandal can touch you then. The county will say the Duke of Halewick saw through a schemer and chose rightly. It is the clean way, cousin, the kind way even she leaves, and the matter dies. It had seemed sound. Sedge's counsel always seemed sound. That was the whole art of the man. And Renwick had done it, and it had felt like justice in the doing. So why could he not stop seeing her face? He turned it over, a schemer, exposed before 200 people, robbed of a duchy at the very door of it. Such a woman shrieks. She weeps. She flings accusations, faints, is carried out. He had braced for all of it. Sedge had warned him to expect a scene, had positioned footmen near the doors. She had smiled and walked out and banked a stranger's fire before dawn. He had that last detail from old Cobb, who had told it to a groom, who had told it to Renwick's own valet, because a house is a country and news runs through it like weather. She banked my fire, your grace, so it did not die before morning. A schemer does not do that. A schemer, ruined and cast out, does not pause on her way into the dark to spare an old porter a cold hearth. There was no profit in it. There was no one left to impress. It was the act of a person who did a small kindness, because kindness was simply what she did, when no one was watching, and nothing could be gained. And a woman like that does not smile like that at the man who has just destroyed her, unless she knows something he does not. The thought had first come to him as a splinter, and had worked its way deeper every day since. He found himself doing what he had not done in years, doubting the account he had been given. He took out Sedge's letters again and read them with a colder eye, and he found nothing wrong, exactly, nothing he could name. Only that they were a little too complete, a little too conveniently timed. The evidence of the false aunt had surfaced precisely when it was needed, and not a day before, and the true bride had been standing ready in the wings, and the whole affair had been arranged with the smooth and total efficiency that marked everything his cousin touched. Rennick had trusted Tolliver Sedge with the running of Halewick for 6 years, since the day the title fell to him. Sedge was tireless, discreet, and never wrong. The tenants feared him, and the accounts balanced, and the Duke had been left free to be a Duke. He had never had cause to look closely at how the smooth machinery of his estate actually ran, because it ran, and a thing that runs invites no inspection. He looked closely now, and he found that he could not in fact say what became of the men who quarreled with his house. He found there had been rather a number of them. He found that when he tried to remember the details, Sedge had always been there first with an explanation so reasonable it dawned before it began. The dawn came up gray over his frozen park. Rennick Vale stood at the glass and felt, for the first time in his ordered life, that he did not know his own house, that something moved inside its walls that he had never seen, and that a girl in a gray gown had seen it in a single evening, and that her smile had been the smile of someone looking at a trap and recognizing it for what it was. He wanted to find her. He wanted it with an intensity that alarmed him, but he did not know her name, her true one, nor where she had gone, and to hunt for her openly was to tell his cousin that his doubt existed, and some cold instinct, newly woken, warned him to tell Tolliver Sedge nothing at all. So he did the only thing he could. He sent, quietly, for the one person in Halewick who had served the house longer than Sedge, who owed the man of business nothing, and who was said to forget nothing that happened within these walls. He sent for old Marable. The interview did not go as the Duke intended, because almost nothing involving Marable ever went as anyone intended. She came to his study on her own slow time, an hour after he sent for her, small and bent and dressed in the black of another century, and she did not curtsy, because she was past the age when a woman curtsies to anyone, and she sat down in the chair across from his desk without being asked. Rennick, who had not been sat down upon uninvited in his own study since boyhood, found he did not mind it. "You sent for me," she said. "You never send for me. So it's the girl." He had prepared a careful approach. She had demolished it in a sentence. "You know of her. I watched her leave." The old eyes fixed on him, pale and terribly clear, which is more than you did, standing there with your hand on the wrong woman's shoulder. She let that sit. "Go on then. Ask what you called me to ask, and I'll tell you whether you're ready to hear the answer." Rennick was a proud man and 40 years her better in rank, and he found, to his own surprise, that he answered her plainly. "I have begun to think I was deceived, not by her, about her. I want to know what you saw." For a long moment the old woman said nothing. The fire ticked. Then she nodded, slowly, as though he had passed a test he had not known he was sitting. "I nursed your father," she said, "and his father. I have watched 3 Dukes of Halewick grow from squalling infants into men, and I have learned to tell in the first year which of them will be ruled by their own eyes, and which will be ruled by another man's tongue. Your grandfather was ruled by his eyes, hard man, cold man, but no one thought for him. Your father," she paused. "Your father was gentler, and a gentler man is easier led, and there was a steward in his day who led him a long way into the dark before he died of it. I watched it happen. I said nothing, because who listens to the nurse? And I have watched the same thing happen to you these 6 years, and said nothing, for the same reason." "Sedge," said Rennick. The name came out of him quietly. "I did not say the name." Marable's mouth thinned. "You said the name. Remember that you said it, and not I when the time comes." She leaned forward, and the firelight caught the deep folds of her face. "I will tell you what I saw, since you've the wit at last to ask. I saw a girl walk out of your hall with the whole county staring, and she did not walk like a woman destroyed, she walked like a woman let go, like something that had been caught and was suddenly, unexpectedly loose. I have seen that walk once before in my long life." The old eyes held his. "On a man leaving this house alive who had expected to leave it dead. Do you understand me, boy? I saw a walk I only ever saw on someone who had escaped." The room had grown very cold, though the fire still burned. "Escaped what?" said Rennick. "That," said Marable, rising with effort, "is the question you should have asked before you gave away the necklace, and not after. I am old, and I know a great many things, but I do not know everything, and I will not spin you a tale to fill the gaps. I will tell you only this, and then I will go back to my rooms, and you may do as you like." She stood over him, small and immovable. "There was a clockmaker here, 2 winters past. A quiet man, Faringway, brought in for the turret clock, and kept longer than a turret clock wants. He was in the house a month. He went home wrong. I saw his face the day he left, and it was the face of a man who has looked into a well and seen something at the bottom, looking back. Within a season, he was dead. A fall, they said." She let the word, said, fall like a stone. "And a year after that, a girl came courting your name who had a way of moving through the rooms of this house that I never once saw her lose her bearings in. A girl who knew the turns of a place she had never been. I marked it at the time. I mark a great many things. No one asks me what I've marked." The ghost of something crossed her face, too dry to be a smile. "You're the first in 20 years. She moved toward the door. Rennick sat rooted, the pieces turning in his mind like the wheels of some vast mechanism he had never before known ran beneath his floors. Marable. His voice stopped her at the threshold. The clockmaker. What was his name? The old woman looked back at him, and for the first time there was something almost like pity in her ancient face. Whether for the dead man or for the living Duke, he could not tell. "Calloway," she said. "Silas Calloway. And if that girl in gray was who I think she was, your Grace, then you did not throw an adventuress out of your house 11 nights ago." She opened the door onto the cold corridor. "Ah. You threw out the only person alive who came here to find out what really happened to him. And a man who does that has enemies inside his own walls that he had better learn to name before they decide he's asked one question too many and see that he has a fall as well." The door closed behind her. Rennick Vale sat alone in the gray morning light, in the great house he had believed he ruled, and understood for the first time that he did not know how many of the deaths beneath his own name had been misadventure, and that the smiling girl he had cast into the dark might be the only soul who could tell him. He had to find her, and somewhere in the house below him, unknown to them both, she had already sealed a letter in the name of a clockmaker's widow and was coming back through his kitchen door. Rennick came back to Halewick on a Thursday, in a farm cart, through the kitchen court, and no one who had stared at her in the great hall knew her at all. That was the first lesson of her new invisibility, and it was a bitter one and a useful one both. She had braced herself to be recognized, to see the flinch of memory in some footman's face. "Isn't that the one? The false bride? The one who smiled?" And she saw nothing. A tradeswoman in brown wool with roughened hands and shorn hair come to mend a clock was not a person to the household of Halewick. She was a function. They looked at her and saw the turret clock's cure, or its failure, and never once the woman underneath. She had thought the shame would be in being brought low. The shame, she found, was in how easy it was, how little of a lady it turned out she had ever needed to be for 200 people to see her at all. Mrs. Ostler, the housekeeper, was a harried woman with no cruelty in her, and no time either, and she handed Rena over to the turret and its long-standing curse with visible relief. "Croat, The clock lived in a stone chamber at the top of the north tower, reached by 109 winding steps, and it was old and vast and beautiful and quite thoroughly sick. Rena climbed to it that first afternoon and stood before the great movement, a thing of iron and brass taller than herself, its wheels the size of cartwheels, and felt her father everywhere in that cold room, for he had stood exactly here and touched exactly this. She began, as he would have, by simply watching it run. And it was in the watching that she found her first ally, though she did not know at once that the woman was an ally, or that she was a woman worth the name. The Lady Coruscant came up the 109 steps on the third day, alone, which no lady does. Rena knew her at once. Of course, the golden laughing woman who now wore the Vero star, who was to be Duchess of Hailwick in Rena's place. She had braced for that too, for the meeting with the woman who had her stolen life clasped about her throat, and she was surprised to feel, when it came, no hatred at all, only a wary and watchful curiosity. Coruscant stood in the doorway of the clock chamber, out of breath, her fine skirts gray with tower dust, and looked at the clockmaker's widow with an expression that was not at all what Rena expected. It was fear. "You're the new one," Coruscant said. "The one who'll mend it or won't." She came in, glancing behind her down the stair. "They say the last two men who tried were dismissed. Do you know why they were dismissed? 'Cause they failed, my lady." "No," Coruscant's voice dropped. "Because they found something and were paid to forget it. One of them told a groom before he left. The groom is gone now too." She twisted the rings on her fingers. "I am not what you think me. Whatever you think me. I did not ask for any of this. I was brought here and told to smile and told what to wear, and the man who arranged it, Mr. Halpus. Sedge is the most frightening person I have ever met, and I do not know how to get out." She looked at Rena with sudden, desperate directness. "You have a clockmaker's eyes. You look at things to understand them. I have watched you look at this house that way, so I will ask you plainly, because I have no one else to ask. Is something wrong? Kier, am I mad, or is something very wrong in this house?" And Rena, who had come to Hailwick trusting no one who smiled, found herself facing a woman who was not smiling at all, a woman as caught in the works as she was, from the other side of it. Every instinct of her long, careful campaign told her to say no. "My lady, nothing is wrong. I only mend clocks." She looked at Coruscant's frightened face, and at the sapphires that had been meant for her own throat, and she made a decision that was not in her plan. "No," Rena said quietly. "You are not mad. Something is very wrong here, and I think you already know more of what it is than I do. You have only been too frightened to lay the pieces side by side." She wiped her hands on her apron. "I mean to lay them side by side, my lady. I could do it faster with a friend inside these walls who is not watched the way a servant is watched, but I'll not ask it of you. It is dangerous past your imagining, and you did not choose it." Coruscant was silent, a long moment. Below them, faintly, the household went about its afternoon. Then the golden woman lifted her chin, and for the first time something steadied in her face. The look of a person who has been drowning, and has just been shown which way the shore lies. "I did not choose to come here," she said, "but I can choose what I do now that I'm caught. Tell me what you need." She reached up and touched the necklace at her throat, and her mouth twisted. "And take this dreadful thing off me the first moment you can. It has never once felt like mine. It feels like it belongs to someone else entirely." Her eyes met Rena's, and something passed between them that neither named. "It feels like I'm wearing it for a woman who isn't here." Rena's breath caught. "Yes," she said softly. "I imagine it does. The something at the bottom of the well was in the chapel, and Rena found it at 2 in the morning, 11 days after her return, and it very nearly cost her everything. She had traced it by the sickness of the clock. That was the thing none of the dismissed men had understood, because none of them had been Silas Calloway's daughter, trained to hear a movement the way a physician hears a chest. The turret clock ran fast. then slow, then stopped, and it did so, she established over long nights of listening, not at random, but whenever a particular thing happened elsewhere in the house. Weight works in the North Tower were linked. Somewhere a line of shafting or a run of concealed wire tied it to another mechanism, so that when that second mechanism was disturbed, the turret clock stuttered in sympathy. Her father had not been called to Halewick to mend the turret clock at all. He had been called because the turret clock's faults were the only outward sign of the hidden thing, and a clever man, mending the one, had traced his way to the other, and seen it, and understood it, and died. It counts the dead. She followed the sympathy of the wheels down through the house, night after night, with the little brass tally wheel in her palm. Like a compass, it led her away from the tower, across the roofs, down into the oldest wing, into the private chapel of Halewick, where the family had worshipped and married and been buried for 300 years. Behind the altar, in the wall, where 3 centuries of dukes and duchesses lay in their stone niches with their names and their dates carved beneath them, there was a mechanism. It was beautiful and it was monstrous. A great brass movement, hidden in the thickness of the wall, its face a ring of small windows, and behind each window a number, and beside each number a name. The names of the dead of Halewick. And the wheels turned, she saw, not with time, but with entries. For the mechanism was joined to the estate's great record books in the muniment room below by a run of fine linkage, so that whenever a death was entered in the official ledger of the house, a wheel advanced, and the tally climbed, and the machine kept its secret count. Her father's brass wheel, the one he had cut and hidden and died for, was the missing piece of it, a piece he had removed and replaced with a copy so that the true count and the false count would diverge. And the difference would prove what he had seen, that the number of deaths the machine had truly counted was greater than the number the house had ever confessed, that someone had been altering the ledgers for years, recording some deaths, hiding others, and that the honest old machine in the wall, built by some long-dead duke to number his mortality before God, had gone on counting the real dead even as the record books lied. The gap between the 2 numbers was the measure of the murders, and her father had found the proof of it and left her the key to reading it and been thrown down the cathedral steps for his cleverness. She stood before it in the dark, with her heart going like a struck bell, and she understood at last the whole of it. She reached up to fit her father's wheel back into its place to make the machine whole, to make it testify, and behind her a voice said, out of the blackness, "I wondered how long it would take you to find it." Rena turned. A lantern flared. Tolliver Sedge stood in the chapel door smiling, and behind him 2 men she did not know, and the smile was the worst thing she had ever seen because it was so entirely without malice. The calm, pleasant, regretful smile of a man of business concluding an item of business. "Miss Calloway," he said. "Yes, I know you. I have known you since the day you wrote to Mrs. Ostler in a widow's name. I read all the letters that come to this house. It is my particular care. I let you come. I let you climb your tower and mend your clock, and creep about my chapel at night, because your father, God rest him, was cleverer than he was wise, and he hid something before he died that I have never been able to find, and I hoped his daughter might lead me to it." His eyes went to the little brass wheel in her hand, and the smile deepened. "And there it is. How very good of you." He held out his palm. "Give it to me, and I promise you a gentler ending than your father had. I am not a cruel man. I take no pleasure in any of it. I simply keep the accounts of this house tidy, the accounts of the living, and, when I must, the accounts of the dead. Your father made an untidiness of himself. Do not make the same mistake." Brenna's back was against the cold wall of the dead. There was no other door. The men moved into the chapel behind him. She closed her hand around her father's wheel. "But you've read all the letters that come to this house," she said. And her voice did not shake, and she was proud of that, later, when she could be proud of anything. "But you never once thought to wonder about the letters that leave it." Sedge's smile faltered for the first time. We'll pause here a moment. If you're the kind of soul who needs to know how a thing like this ends, and I think you are, or you'd not have come this far with us, then stay close and subscribe so the rest of the story finds its way to you. The letters that had left the house had gone, over those careful days, to 3 places, and Rena named them into the ringing silence of the chapel one by one. "There is a letter with the magistrate at Ferring," she said, "not to be opened unless I fail to collect it in person by month's end. There is a letter with my father's guild, the clockmakers of the county, who did not believe misadventure any more than I did, and who have wanted a reason to move against this house for 2 years. And there is a letter, Mr. Pro. Sedge, in the hand of a lady of this household sealed with a ring you will recognize, setting down everything she has seen and been made to do since she was brought here to smile and wear another woman's necklace." Rena lifted her chin. "You cannot read the letters that leave because they did not go by the post. They went by hands you never thought to watch because you never think of servants and frightened women as people who can act. That was always your mistake. It was the Duke's mistake, too. It is the mistake this whole house is built on." Sedge stood very still. The 2 men behind him glanced at one another. "You are bluffing," he said, but the pleasant certainty had gone out of his voice. "Perhaps." Rena took 1 step toward him, and it was he, not she, who gave ground. "But you have spent your life on tidy accounts, Mr. Four. Sedge, and you are a man who understands a wager. If I am bluffing, you gain a few quiet years. If I am not, then the moment I fail to walk out of this chapel on my own feet, 3 sealed letters open in 3 different places at once, and the number in that wall becomes the most famous number in the county, set beside the false one in your ledgers, in a machine no jury will fail to understand." She let it settle. "You cannot make me disappear tidily. I have already made myself impossible to lose. Quietly. That was the whole of my work these past days. Not the wheel. This." For a long moment the chapel held its breath, and then, from the doorway behind Sedge, a second lantern rose, and a voice that Rena knew, that the whole county knew, said, low and terrible, "Stand away from her, Tolliver." Rennick Vale stood in the chapel door in his shirt sleeves, and his face in the lantern light was not the cold mask of the great hall. It was the face of a man who had been standing in the dark passage for a long time, listening, who had followed his cousin the way his cousin followed everyone, quietly, unseen, because old Marable had told him where the true center of his house lay, and he had at last learned to go and look at a thing with his own eyes. He had heard, Rena understood, all of it. The count, the ledgers, the confession made in that pleasant, businesslike voice. "Cousin," said Sedge, turning, and the smile came back onto his face like a man pulling on a familiar coat. "How fortunate! There is a thief in your chapel, the same false bride, come back in disguise and meddling with the family monuments. I have caught her in the act. Help me hold her for the constable, and we will." "Her name," said Rennick, and his voice was very quiet, "is Rena Calloway. I have known that much since the morning after I threw her out. I have simply lacked the courage to act on it until tonight." He came into the chapel, and the 2 hired men fell back from him, because he was still their Duke, and blood is old. "What I did not know until this moment, Tolliver, is that you keep the accounts of the dead of this house tidy. When you must, you said the words yourself. I heard them from the passage. Ham." His eyes moved to the mechanism in the wall, to the ring of small windows and their climbing numbers, and Rena saw the exact moment he understood what he was looking at. His face went gray. "How many?" he said. "How many of them are real, and hidden, and standing to my name?" Sedge said nothing. "How many?" the Duke said again, and it was not a question now but a demand that shook the stones, "are counted in that wall that are not written in my books?" And into that silence, Rena Calloway, clockmaker's daughter, false bride, the woman he had cast into the dark 11 nights and a lifetime ago, reached up behind her without turning and with the sure hands her father had trained, fitted the last brass wheel into its place. The machine, made whole after 2 years, gave a single deep click that rang through the whole chapel like a struck bell. And every small window in its face turned over at once, and the true count of the dead of Hailwick stood at last revealed in the lantern light, for the Duke and the murderer and the clockmaker's daughter all to read together. The number was not small. Renwick Vale looked at it and looked at his cousin, and Rena watched 6 years of comfortable blindness fall away from a proud man's face all at once, leaving something raw and more dangerous underneath.
"Take him!"
the Duke said to his own footman, who had come up the passage behind him. His voice had gone to iron. "Wake the house! Wake the magistrate! No one leaves Hailwick tonight!" And then, more quietly, to the smiling man who had run his life, "You told me the clean way was to shame her before 200 witnesses. Let us see how you like the clean way, Tolliver, when the witnesses are counting." Sedge stopped smiling. They did not sleep at Hailwick that night, and the house that woke was not the house that had gone to bed. The magistrate came at dawn, a heavy, cautious man named Bramber, who had signed his name under misadventure more than once in his years, and had never once liked the taste of it. Renwick met him in the chapel and did not spare himself. He did not say, "My cousin deceived me." He said, "I did not look. I had a house that ran smoothly, and a man who ran it, and I asked no questions, because questions are labor, and I preferred my ease. What was done in my name was done because I chose not to see it. Write that down as well." And Bramber, who had come prepared to be managed by a duke, as he had always been managed by this house, looked at the gray-faced man before him and slowly put away the deference he had brought and took out instead the notebook he had not expected to need. It was not what the magistrate had braced for on the ride out. He had assumed, for it was how these things always went with the great houses, that he would arrive to find the blame already parceled out and pinned to some convenient underling, the Duke untouchable behind a wall of lawyers, the whole affair prearranged into a shape that troubled no one who mattered. He had ridden out, resigned to it. Instead, he found a Duke naming his own negligence into the record before anyone had asked him to, and a clockmaker's daughter in a plain gown treating a Duke's chapel as her workshop, and he understood within the first quarter hour that whatever else this was, it was not going to be tidied. Something in Bramber that had gone to sleep years ago, under the weight of all the pages he had signed against his own judgment, woke up and stretched and began cautiously to do its proper work. The mechanism in the wall did the rest. Rena showed them how to read it, how the honest wheels had counted every death entered below, and how her father's cut had split the true tally from the false, and set beside the estate's own ledgers, brought up from the muniment room and laid open on the altar steps. The gap between the 2 columns was a thing no one in that chapel could argue away. Names in the machine that were in no book, deaths that had happened and been unhappened with a stroke of a clerk's pen. It was, as she had promised, said it would be, the kind of evidence a plain man understands, not a story that could be twisted, but a number that could be counted by anyone, twice, and come out the same. She talked Bramber through it as her father would have, plainly and without flourish, because a truth dressed up begins to look like a lie, and she wanted no part of it looking like anything but what it was. She showed him the wheel her father had cut, and the copy he had left in its place, and how the tiny difference in the teeth had made the false wheel skip a tooth now and again, and how that skip, and only that skip, had traveled up the concealed linkage to the great turret clock in the north tower, so that for 2 years the whole county had heard the sickness of the hidden thing chiming out across the park every time a death was quietly erased below, and never once known what they were hearing. That was his message, she said quietly. He could not write to me. He was watched, so he left the fault in the clock, knowing that one day a clockmaker would be sent for, who could hear what it was truly saying. He left it for me. It took me 2 years to answer him. Bramber, who had a daughter of his own, had to look away and study his notebook for a while before he could go on. There was a bad hour, near the end, when one of Sedge's two men, the younger, a groom's son who had done as he was told without ever letting himself understand what he was doing, broke and told the rest of it, the steward who was to have talked the others. Each name he spoke, Rena found the matching window in the wall and the matching absence in the book, and laid the two side by side for the magistrate to write down. It was slow and terrible work, and she did it without once raising her voice. And when it was done, the count in the wall and the count in the ledgers had a name between them for every soul the difference had ever stood for. No one in that chapel would ever again be able to say the thing had not happened. That was what her father had died to make possible, and she had made it possible. And she felt, doing it, neither triumph nor grief, but a vast and steadying quiet, as though a movement long jammed had finally been freed to run. Sedge said very little. He had the sense, at the end, to see that cleverness had left him, and he met his arrest with the same smooth composure he had brought to everything, as though being taken by the constable were merely one more item of business, concluded not quite to his satisfaction. Only once did the mask slip, as they led him past Rena in the cold grey chapel. He paused and looked at her with something that was almost respect and entirely without warmth. "Your father," he said, "was the cleverest man I ever killed. I did not think he had left anyone behind who was cleverer. He inclined his head precisely as a man does to an equal. I underestimated the daughter. It is the only account of mine that will not balance." "No," said Rena. "You underestimated everyone. The porter you never noticed, the lady you thought was a puppet, the old woman in the north rooms you never bothered to fear. You thought the only people who mattered were the ones with power, and so you never watched the ones without it. And it was the ones without it who counted you in the end." She did not raise her voice. "Go and be tidied away, Mr. Sedge. You of all men should appreciate it. They took him out. She did not watch him go. She found she had no wish to." It was Corisande who wept, afterward, not for Sedge, but from the sheer release of it, the terror of months breaking all at once. She had come down to the chapel in a wrapper with her hair loose, and she had done a brave thing that Rena would not forget. She had stood before the magistrate, this frightened, borrowed bride, and told him plainly how she had been brought to Halewick and coached and dressed, and made into a weapon against a woman she had never met. And she had done it knowing it stripped her of every claim to the very grandeur that had been dangled before her. Then, with hands that shook, she had reached up and unclasped the Vero star from her own throat. She held it out to Rena across the cold chapel, 300 years of white gold and sapphire pooling in her open palm. "This was never mine," Corisande said. "I think we both always knew whose it was." Rena looked at the necklace. She looked at the woman, holding it out, no longer a rival, no longer golden and laughing and terrible, only a person who had been caught in the same machine and had chosen at the end to be brave. And Rena did a thing that surprised them both. She folded Corisande's fingers gently back over the stones. "Keep it a while longer," she said. "It is safe with you. And I find," she added, and here at last her own voice was not quite steady, "that I have not yet decided whether I want it, or only wanted to be the one who chose." Above them, unseen in the narrow window of the north rooms, old Marable watched the lanterns move through the dark chapel and the small gray figure standing straight backed among the powerful, and she nodded once slowly to herself, as though a long account of her own had finally come right. The reckoning that mattered most did not happen in the chapel with the magistrate. It happened 3 days later in the great hall, and it was the Duke of Halewick who insisted upon it, and it cost him more than anything the law required. He could have let the thing be quiet. Bramber advised it. A scandal of this size, hushed and managed, would spare the house. That was the old way, the clean way, the tidy way, the way of the man now sitting in the county jail. Renwick Vale had lived his whole life by it, and it had made him blind, and he was done with it. So he called them back, not 200 this time, but enough. the magistrate, the clockmakers' guild, who came in a body, grim men in good black coats who had waited 2 years for this. The families, where they could be found of the names in the wall that were in no book. And the household of Hailwick itself, every soul of it, from the steward to the scullery, made to stand in the hall where they had watched a girl in grey walk out, because Rennick had decided that a house which had been permitted to look away from murder would now be required to look at the truth of it and at the woman it had wronged. In the same room and by the same light, it was a costly thing to do, and he knew it. A hushed scandal fades. A public one is remembered for generations, and the name of Hailwick would now carry this stain openly for as long as the house stood. Bramber warned him again the morning of it plainly, out of something that had become almost friendship. "You need not do this to yourself, your grace. The law is satisfied. The county need not be." And Rennick had answered, "The county was made to watch me put that necklace on the wrong woman. It watched her walk out in silence and thought the matter closed because I told it to. I will not now ask it to look away a second time from a thing it ought to see. A house that has only ever shown the pleasant version of itself becomes exactly the house this one became. I would rather be a house that remembers." So he did it, though it cost his pride more than the law ever could, and it was, Rena thought watching him, the truest measure of how far the granite man had traveled. He had the Vero star brought down, and he had Rena brought in, not in brown wool now, nor in dove-gray silk, but in a plain dark gown of her own choosing, a clockmaker's daughter dressed as exactly what she was. Before he came to her, he did the harder thing first. He had the names read out. Every one of them, each soul the machine had counted and the books had denied, read slowly into the hall by the clerk of the guild, and after each name a pause, and in that pause, here and there among the gathered families, a sound, a mother's breath going out of her, a brother's fist closing. The small broken noises of people who had been told for years that their dead had simply wandered off, or run into debt, or come to some careless end, and who now heard, in a duke's own hall, and under a duke's own roof, the truth spoken plainly at last. Some of them had come, not knowing why they had been summoned. They left knowing exactly where their people had gone, and that the knowing had been bought for them by a stranger in a plain, dark gown who had asked them for nothing. More than one of them tried, afterward, to take Rena's hand and thank her, and she let them, though it undid her more than any cruelty of the past year had managed, because grief that has finally been allowed to be true is the hardest thing in the world to stand beside. Only when the last name had been read and the last silence kept, did he come the length of the hall to meet her, past all of them, and before the whole assembled house. He did the thing a duke is never made to do. He bowed to her. Quote, "Low and long, the bow one gives to a person one has wronged and cannot fully repay. I will not clasp this at your throat," he said, and his voice carried because he meant it to. "I have learned what it means when the men of this house put that necklace where it does not belong. It is not mine to give you, and it never was. It belongs to whoever this house has made a true promise to, and this house has made you no promise it has kept, so I will not give it. I will say instead, before all of them, the only thing I have the right to say." He straightened. "Your name is Rena Calloway. Your father was Silas Calloway, an honest man, who came into my house to mend a clock and found a murder, and was killed for the finding and buried under a lie that I let stand because I could not be troubled to doubt it. You came here to prove it, alone, against all of us, and you did. Every death that was hidden will now be named. Every family will be told. The lie is over, and it is over because of you." He looked at her, and the cold granite face the county had feared for 6 years was simply gone, and what stood in its place was a man. "This house owes you a debt it cannot pay. I will spend the rest of my life failing to pay it." I wanted them all to hear me begin. Into the silence, Rena Calloway, who had walked out of this hall to 200 stairs without a word, found that she could speak. "My father used to say," she said, and her voice did not shake, that you cannot hurry a movement without breaking it, that everything true runs at the speed it runs, and the work is only to keep it clean and let it tell the time honestly. She looked down the hall, at the faces that had watched her go and now watched her stay. You buried him as a man who fell. I could not bear it, so I made myself a lie in order to prove a truth, and I have been so many people in this house, a bride, a widow, a servant, a name out of a dead woman's papers, that there were nights I could scarcely find the real one underneath. Her eyes came back to the Duke. But he is named now honestly, in the place where he died, and a daughter cannot ask for more than that. Whatever else this house owes me, that debt is paid. I heard you pay it. That is enough. It was not, in the end, the necklace that undid them all where they stood. It was that, the plainness of it, the girl who had asked for nothing but her father's honest name, and had been given it at last aloud in the room that had denied it. Old Cobb, come up from his gate for the first time in years, wept openly and was not ashamed. And high at the back of the hall, unnoticed as ever, old Marrable watched the Duke of Hailwick stand before a clockmaker's daughter as an equal, and murmured to no one, There is the man your grandfather was. 20 years I waited to see it. Then she turned and went back to her rooms, her long watching over, content. Summer came late to Hailwick that year, but it came. The great turret clock ran true for the first time in living memory. Rena had mended it in the end, once the thing it had been secretly tied to was torn out of the chapel wall and carried away as evidence, so that the honest movement was free to do only its honest work. On still days you could hear it strike the hours clean across the park, and the sound had lost the thing the county had never quite named in it, the faint wrongness, the sense of a housekeeping account it would not speak. Now it only told the time. People remarked how much lighter the place felt, and could not say why, and Rena, who could have told them, only smiled. The house itself changed in smaller ways that were harder to name. The servants who had learned, under Sedge, to keep their eyes down and their questions swallowed, found that questions were no longer dangerous, and a household that is permitted to speak is a different creature from one that is not. Osler, freed of the man who had read every letter that came to her door, seemed to grow a decade younger. New people came, honest ones, hired now by a duke who had learned to look at a person twice. And old Marrable, who had watched it all from the north rooms for 20 silent years, lived long enough to see the summer through and to take her tea, once, in the mended chapel with Rena beside her, the only person in half a century she had judged worth the walking distance. She said little, as always, but at the end of it she put one knotted hand over the younger woman's and said, I told them they'd thrown out the one they needed. No one listens to the nurse. A dry flicker of a smile. You listened. That's enough for a life. She died in her sleep, not long after, in the oldest part of the house she had outlasted 3 masters of, and Rennick had her buried among the family, in the honest chapel, which scandalized the county, and which he did not for one moment regret. She had not left, Rena that is. That surprised the county more than anything, and it surprised Rena a little too. She had every reason to go. Her father was cleared. A plain stone in Faring now told the truth over him. The stolen years could not be given back, but what could be restored was being restored. Sedge's tidy accounts, unraveled by the guild's grim accountants, gave up a good deal that had been quietly taken from a good many people, the Calloways among them. She was not a rich woman, but she was her own woman with a trade in her hands, and no one's name to answer to but her own. She could have gone anywhere. The Duke had asked her to stay. He had done it badly, which she found she liked. A man so long fluent in cold command turned out to have no words at all for asking, and had to reach for them one at a time, and the reaching cost him visibly, and that was worth more to her than any smoothness could have been. The clocks of this house are all sick, he had said, standing in the doorway of the tower chamber, formal as a man reading a proclamation. And the ledgers are in ruin, and there is a great deal here that wants an honest and exacting hand to set it right, and I find—" He had stopped, started again. "I find I do not want you to be a stranger who mended one clock and left. I have been surrounded my whole life by people who told me what I wished to hear. You are the only person who ever walked into this house and told it the truth by simply refusing to be anything but true. I do not want to lose that. I do not." And here, the proclamation had failed him entirely. "I do not want to lose you. Stay. Not as a servant, not as a bride bargained for by another man, as yourself, and let us see, slowly, what yourself and myself might make. I am a patient man in everything but this, and in this I find I have no patience left at all." So she had stayed, as keeper of the house's clocks, and quietly, of a good deal more, for a house so long run on lies, wanted someone in it whose whole nature was to make crooked things run straight. She took rooms of her own in the east wing. She was no one's servant and no one's pretender. And what grew between the clockmaker's daughter and the Duke of Hailwick grew the way she had always trusted true things to grow, at the speed it ran, unhurried, not to be forced without breaking. It was autumn, a full year, from the night he had placed the necklace on the wrong woman's throat, when he asked her the other question. They were in the chapel of all places, repaired now, the raw scar in the wall made whole with plain new stone, a place of the honest dead again and not a machine for hiding them. He had brought the Vero star. Coruscant had returned it before she left Hailwick for a quieter life of her own choosing, and the two women had parted not as rivals, but very nearly as friends, which neither had expected, and both came to treasure. Rennick held the necklace, 300 years of white gold running through his fingers like water, exactly as he had held it a year before. "The last time I held this," he said, "I put it on the wrong woman, in front of the whole county, and the right one smiled and walked away, and I have never in my life been so glad to have been so wrong. For the smile brought me you." He did not fasten it. He held it out to her, open on his two hands, the way Coruscant had once held it out, the way a thing is offered and not imposed. "I will not clasp it at your throat, Rena. I have done that once and learned what it is worth when a man decides for a woman where she belongs. So I only ask, not the house's promise, mine. Will you wear it because you choose to, and for no other reason under heaven?" And Rena Calloway looked at the necklace, and at the man holding it out to her with his hands not quite steady, in the honest light of the mended chapel. And she understood that this was the thing she had truly been waiting for, not the stones, not the title, not even the justice. But to stand in this house at last as no one's disguise and no one's victim, wholly herself, and be asked. She reached out, but she did not take the necklace from him. Instead, she closed her own hands over his, over the stones, the way she had once closed Coruscant's fingers back over and she looked up at him and gave him the same small, calm, almost kind smile that had haunted him for a year. Only now he understood it, now he was inside it instead of shut out of it, and it was the most welcome thing he had ever seen. "You are learning," she said softly. "A year ago you fastened it on a woman who did not want it. Today you held it out and asked. Give me a little longer, and I think you may even learn to let me be the one to put it on." Her smile deepened. "Yes, Rennick, I will wear it, but I will clasp it myself. I have spent long enough being something other people fastened into place." And there in the quiet chapel where her father's murder had been hidden and then brought into the light, Rena Calloway lifted the Vero star in her own two hands and reached up and fastened 300 years of white gold about her own throat by her own choice, in her own name. At last, while the Duke of Hailwick watched a woman claim what was hers with a joy on his face that no one in that cold house had seen there in 20 years. Far off across the summer park, honest now and telling only the time, the great clock began to strike the hour. They stood and listened to it ring the count all the way out, clean and true, with nothing hidden in it at all. And the silence of Hailwick, which had for so long been the silence of things unspoken and dead uncounted, was filled at last, not with grief and not with lies, but with a quiet, patient, hard-won love that had been sought in the dark and found in the light, and clasped in the end by the hand it truly belonged to.